Hey everyone, have you ever wondered what are those top 10 services that you need to learn in order to become a data engineer? If so, please stay tuned. In this video, I'll be covering those most commonly used services across multiple cloud platform. So we'll cover these services in AWS, Azure, and GCP. So before we start, if you're new to my channel, make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss any of the videos in this series. All right, so let's get started. So the most first and topmost services that are very famous in any of the cloud engineering, data engineering projects is the data lake, right? It's also called as the object storage. And for the data lake in AWS, we have S3, and in Azure, we have the blob storage, and on the GCP, we have cloud storage. So these are the services which are primarily used for data lake purposes, and also storing any of your data in data files, or any image file, or audio, video, or any type of relational, structured or non-structured, semi-structured, all type of data would be stored on this services. And the next one in the line is managed database services. See, in most of the projects, we will have the need for the RDS databases, like relational data store type of SQL databases. So on the AWS side, we have Amazon RDS, and on the Azure, we have the Azure SQL database, and on your GCP, you have Cloud SQL. So these are the services primarily used for managed database services. Remember, these are still relational in nature, and they're not really meant for data warehousing purposes or analytical purposes. Of course, if you have a smaller data set, we can still use it, but they are ideally meant for the relational data stores. Okay, so the next on the list, the third one, is the NoSQL databases. So NoSQL databases are primarily used for storing the data in a key value pair mode, right? Whether you have a document or a JSON, this type of data is primarily being managed using the NoSQL database. So in AWS side, you have DynamoDB, and on the Azure side, you have Cosmos DB, and on the GCP, you have Cloud Firestore. So this is the NoSQL solutioning, which are heavily used in order to process huge amount of data in NoSQL or document DB type of databases. All right, the fourth one is the data warehousing solutions. So, sorry, data warehousing solutions. For the data warehousing on the AWS side, we have Amazon Redshift, and on the Azure we have Synapse, and on the GCP side we have Google BigQuery. So these are the petabyte scale data warehousing solutions built in these cloud vendors. And they are very famous, and they are primarily used for analytical purposes in order to create and manage your data warehouse, data marts, and all of that. Okay, and moving on, we have the data integration. See, once we have the object store, and then the RDS store and the data warehousing, you need something to load the data as well, right? So for the data integration part, we have Glue in the AWS region, and the data factory in Azure cloud, and also you have cloud data flow in case of GCP. So these are the services responsible for data integration, extraction, or it's also called as ingestion, data ingestion. Let's say you have API source or a database source, or it can be any file on S3. So in order to process any data from any file system to an RDS, or to DynamoDB or Redshift, be it on any technology, Glue is a type of ETL tool available in AWS environment, which will help us integrate the data from several sources, transform it, and then also load it. So it's a typical ETL processing on AWS, and the data factory is on Azure, and the Google side, it's a data flow. Okay, so the next service on the list is the big data processing. See, in case of data integration, if you have a minimal amount of data, then data integration would just work fine. But if you have huge volume of data, then you need to have this big data processing, right? So for that, Amazon has the EMR, Elastic MapReduce. So it's basically a Hadoop environment wherein you will have HDFS, Hive, and the Spark. So using the Spark in-memory computation, you can do big data processing. It can be a multi-node cluster, and your data will be processing in the distributed fashion. So similarly, Azure has got HD Insight, and GCP has that Cloud Data Proc. So these services are primarily used for big data processing in each of this cloud area. All right. So next one is the serverless compute. Right. So if you have smaller loaders or event-based triggers, let's say you want to move the files from one directory to other, if you wanted to process some API data, or if you have any small-scale data processing, that for those you can use serverless compute. So on the AWS side, you have Lambda, and Azure has got functions, and GCP has got cloud functions. So these are the services responsible for serverless computing. However, please note the data integration or big data processing are meant for high volume of data, longer processing, whereas this serverless compute is meant for like a smaller amount of data or event based triggers or any smaller set of activity, because they will have some sort of timeout. For example, Lambda has got 15 minutes timeout. If your data processing is not done in 15 minutes, the Lambda way is going to fail, right? So there is a limitation, but there is an advantage for the smaller data processing. Okay, it can be anything. It can be as good as generating thumbnails for the image for file uploaded, or it can be transcribing your video content in the form of text, or it can be used for any other purposes. All right, so next one in the list is workflow orchestration. Right, so let's say we have built, you have your database ready, you have your data warehousing, you have the data integration, all that data, big data processing is done. You will need a workflow orchestration as well, because you know when you do any data engineering projects, you will have hundreds of tables, and maybe the first 10 tables are depending on the next 20 tables. So in that case, you need to have this sort of dependencies, right? The workflow one, only if this is successfully done, then you need to trigger the second workflow and then the third workflow. So wherever you have such dependency to process one after the other, this is where the workflow orchestration comes into picture. So in the AWS side, you have step functions, and Azure side, you have logic apps, and then you have cloud workflows, right? So using this type of functions, orchestration, step functions, you can set this kind of workflow. So once you have this workflow, it can, the step one in the step function can be to trigger lambda processing, and in the step 2 it can trigger some big data processing, and the step 3 can be file archival. So this way you can set the sequencing and set the workflow. Okay, and then the next service is event bus. See, this is primarily used for scheduling purposes, right? You have your ETL ready, you have the processing ready, you have this workflow created, you have your database ready. You have to have that scheduling also, correct? So let's say you have 10 different lambda jobs and 20 glue jobs, and there are like 10 RDS procedures. So in this case, if you want to schedule it, let's say all the lambda should be scheduled at 10 p.m. and the glue jobs to be done at 11 a.m. and the remaining can be 12 p.m. So if you have such requirement, which of course will have most of the data engineering projects, so event-based scheduling will help us schedule your jobs. Okay, so Event Bridge is the service in AWS 10, and Event Grid is the Azure service, and Cloud Pabansa based on GCP side. Okay, so these are some of the services which are very primarily used in any of the data engineering projects. And the last one is the data lake query services. So why do we need data lake query services is because, see, we have hundreds of files, data files residing on the object store, AS3 or a blob store. So you need to have a way instead of, even before you load this data into RDS or Redshift, you need to be querying the data right directly from the S3. So what you do is you create like an external table, okay, external table, and that can connect to S3 files. You don't need any databases at all. You don't need the data on the S3 to be present in the database. You can directly query the data directly from S3 blob store or cloud storage using these services. So Redshift Spectrum is a type of service. This comes with when we have the Amazon Redshift in place, right? If you have a Redshift, so Redshift Spectrum will help us query data directly from S3. So similarly, Synapse SQL Serverless is a part of Synapse data warehouse solution, which will help us read data directly from blob storage. So similarly, on GCP side, you have the BigQuery. Okay, so it's similar to this data warehousing solution. So these are the top 10 services that are must and should. I mean, we have to learn these most commonly used services in order to become a data engineer. In most of the data engineering projects, these are the most frequently covered services that you need to be well aware of. I hope this video was interesting and you learned something. Make sure to give a thumbs up and share the knowledge and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any of my upcoming videos. Right? Thank you.